Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Pro Tactics segment. Our guest today is an 8-year tour pro, but he's done a lot in 8 years. He's got 21 top 10 finishes, 2 FLW Cup appearances, 7 tour level wins. He's also an offshore expert, which is why we have him with us today. Welcome to the show, Jason Lambert.
Hey guys, I'm glad to be here. It's always good to come on and talk fishing, especially when we're talking Tennessee River ledge fishing, offshore fishing, Garmin electronics and the things that we grew up doing back out here east. I know a lot of guys on the West Coast do the same thing with some of the spotted bass lakes and all, and electronics play a big role. So give me the opportunity to talk about it, and you can't shut me up, man.
Well, this is the thing. When I was doing some prep work for this, I was looking at your bio, and I saw 7 tour wins, but 6 of those are either Kentucky Lake or Pickwick Lake, and those are ledge lakes, right?
They really are. I mean, of those 7 wins, 6 of those are actually 5 of the 6 wins on the Tennessee River. 5 of those were exclusively offshore ledge fishing events, and I did win I won an event on Pickwick in the fall where there was a lot of grass fishing and topwater fishing. And the other win I had was down at Okeechobee, and you don't think about a Tennessee River guy going to Okeechobee fishing in 3, 4, 5 feet of water and doing well, but the one thing that gets overlooked about the Tennessee River is hydrilla and grass. And growing up fishing hydrilla and grass, anytime we go to a place like Okeechobee or anywhere else that has offshore grass bite, then man, I feel right at home.
Well, this is going to seem like a really obvious question, but we got to start somewhere. And I wanted you to I wanted you to tell us about the role that your electronics play in these kind of ledge events, these offshore events. I know a lot of people that are, myself included, that are very intimidated about fishing away from the bank. And, it's that electronics thing, and you obviously are not concerned about that. So talk about how you use your electronics in those kind of events.
Well, electronics fishing is really no different than, for me doing it growing up the way that I've done it my whole entire life. We're still throwing at a target, so you're just seeing the target on the screen versus seeing it on the bank or a brush or, a piece of brush or a tree or something, whatever you're flipping to. A lot of guys grow up bass fishing and they're fishing to a specific target. We're doing the exact same thing offshore fishing. So, electronics, there's a couple of different parts to it. Number one is the mapping. I mean, any lake you go to now, the maps are so good. So you're not idling around for days looking for structure. The structure is already there. So it's just, electronics fishing is nothing more than confidence. I mean, it's nothing more than you got, some guys out on the California Delta have this specific flipping bait that they go and they know they're going to get bit on it. They're going to flip. Electronics is the same thing. Once you get the confidence in what you're looking at on your screens, then it becomes, find them is the easy part. Catching them is the work. So finding them is the easy part. And you just spend hours and hours and relentless hours just idling and looking, trying to find schools of fish that set up a certain way, that look a certain way. A lot of it's just experience from being over here on the Tennessee River for so long, but knowing, which one of those creek intersections to look at, current facing points versus, soft points. And it's just experience. It's time on the water. There is no substitute for time on the water. I've been doing it so long out here on this river, especially looking at stuff. You know what you're looking for, and you know when you see it.
I've watched you. I've listened to you talk before, and you are notorious for pre-fishes where you're just basically driving around looking at electronics. What are you looking for? I mean, are you looking for? I'm sure you're looking for fish, but are you looking for certain types of breaks or cover? What is it you're looking for out there?
With the amount of experience I've got up and down the Tennessee River, and you fall in other river systems that we fish that become ledge tournaments, you kind of know going into it what kind of structure you're looking for. Usually based on the time of the year, what kind of depth range they're in, what kind of structure, whether they're, halfway between the creek and the river. There's different stages of offshore fishing, just like there is spawn fishing, pre-spawn fishing, whatever. So there's it's a migration process, just like it is in the fall when they're following the shad in. You kind of follow those fish from those spawning areas out to their summertime areas. So based on the time of the year it is, kind of the areas to look for. And as soon as you get there and you start looking and you start seeing some fish in some certain places, then it kind of cues you in more on exactly what to look for. But I'm looking for absolutely nothing but the fish. I mean, you should know by the time you get there what kind of structure you're looking at and looking for. So at that point, it's strictly fish. I'm looking for fish, groups of fish that are not just numbers of fish. I mean, I'll stop on a place that's got 2 or 3 fish, sometimes 3 or 4 fish, but it's how they're positioned, how they're related to the bottom and how the group of fish is related together, because you can almost tell immediately when you see them if those fish will bite or not. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's just I guess offshore science, because you've seen it so much. You can almost look at a group of fish as soon as you see them and go, those will bite and those won't. So, it really doesn't do any good to fish for them in practice. I mean, so that's why you hear us Tennessee River guys talk about, man, we spent 3 days, 3 days on the water, and 30 hours of it I spent, putting hours on my motor because I was idling. There's really no need to throw to them in practice. I mean, you can figure out in the tournament how to catch them. I mean, we all know, coming from out here, we know how to catch them. And that's the one thing I think separates, myself and a few other guys from the rest of the ledge fishing world is, growing up doing it, you kind of know how to fire those big ones. You know how to make those big ones bite. So it's honestly, it's just kind of useless to make a cast in practice unless you just stop on what we call a community hole, just to take out some frustration of hours and hours of idling and beat on a few. But, once you see when I see what I want to see, there's no need to make a cast until that fish actually counts.
That's just great stuff. Now, obviously the technology in today's electronics have changed, but I'm an old enough guy that, I grew up with paper graphs, and we didn't necessarily have the luxury of seeing a lot of fish. You could sometimes see a fish, but you'd see, more of a drop off and things like that. And of course today is like the Garmin unit, for example. I mean, it's so clear and you see so much. My question was going to be, do you have to see fish to make that a spot you want to fish, or is there something about the structure itself that will produce?
I will not make a cast unless I see fish, ever. I mean, to me, it's, flipping grass or, fishing. A million other different tactics is different. Offshore fishing is why you can be so productive doing it is, unless you actually see the fish there, there's no reason to make a cast. I mean, if you come up to a clump of grass and you could look in that clump of grass and see there's not a fish there, you wouldn't fish it. So, out deep, you have that luxury. Once those fish get out there deep enough that you can actually visually see them, then there's absolutely no reason to ever make a cast until you see them.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, when you're going to a new lake, and I mean, I'm sure you're faced with new lakes sometimes. You've got a lot of experience, but I'm sure you're faced with new lakes. Do you start with your maps, or do you use like Google Earth? What do you use to kind of direct you to where you're going to go and start looking?
A little bit of both. I mean, if it's going to be if we think it's an offshore structure tournament, then obviously I'm going to start with my mapping. I'm going to look at contours. I'm going to look at, intersections, creek intersections, channel swings, certain things that fish relate to, especially even more so if it's a current-based fishery where current plays a role, then you're obviously going to look for any kind of current break. But I'll give you an example, and I can't talk a lot about it because it's, you won't know the results until the show comes out. But we just did a Major League Fishing Cup down in Waco, Texas here, 1st of October. So the way the cups work, we get 0 practice, you get 0 preparation. It's the original Major League Fishing format. You show up, you get in a boat, and when you pull up to the ramp, you know what lake you're going to. So any lake that I go to, especially, post-spawn all the way up into fall fishing, I spent my whole entire 30-minute ride around looking at graphs. And that's my strength. That's my security blanket, is knowing what I look at when I, knowing what I see when I look at it. So, it's a confidence thing for me. I know that if I see them out there, I can confidently catch them. So it's no different for me than yourself flipping a certain color plastic, certain weight, or some guy throwing a certain spinner bait or a certain top water or whatever. A big portion of fishing is confidence, and my confidence is offshore. So, once I go into a lake, unless it's hard on spawn, I mean, if it's spawn, the offshore deal is completely out of the question. A lot of lakes where you get pre-spawn stuff, you got fish staging coming in. Certain lakes, especially when you get way south, you got fish in all three stages. You'll have pre-spawners, spawners, and post-spawners, so you can catch them, fish coming in and fish coming out. So for me, it always starts with the mapping, if it's going to be an offshore structured deal. But Google Earth is a big factor too, because a lot of places you can really see from the satellite imagery, you can see certain breaks that you can't really see necessarily on graphs, or how they lay, because you get shadowing, you get different things. The Google Earth probably comes into play more for me when I go to a lake that I just don't know anything about, and I'm really trying to find vegetation, lily pads, certain things. I always laugh and joke with the guys that say, I'm the best dock skipper there is in the world. I mean, once I get to one corner of the dock, I kick the trolling motor on high and I skip around to the other side. So I'm not looking for docks because I'm not very good at it. But, vegetation, Google Earth, and that kind of thing comes in real handy.
Talk to us about your equipment. I mean, you guys have so many different units on the front of your boat and at your console. Take us through what you use. You've got a couple things there on the console, I'm sure, and up front. Tell us about all that stuff.
I've ran the same setup for years. I run, two 12-inch 126 Garmins at the console. My left unit is always my mapping and 2D, and my right unit is my imagery. It's, it'd be clear view and side view. And then up front, I run two units as well. The back unit up front is still traditional, the way we've always fished it. It's, a map and just a 2D sonar. But then the front unit is Panoptics. I mean, I know you guys have heard a lot about Livescope and Panoptics from Garmin, and I almost now I've used it so much for the last 3, 4, 5 years that I almost feel like I'm naked without it. I mean, and I don't necessarily use it all the time on the Tennessee River, but the places that it comes in handy, especially if you're target fishing, or even on the Tennessee River where you're catching a big school of fish and all of a sudden they quit and you can just look around with the unit and find them. But yeah, I run 4 units. 3 of them are set up traditionally the way we've always fished them, but that Panoptics up front it's a 1/2 case now.
I've heard you talk about HydroWave and that you swear by HydroWave. What is HydroWave?
HydroWave is it is another electronic device that we don't have enough of them in our lives anymore. It don't seem like, but HydroWave emits different sounds, and you can turn it to different settings, whether it be a shad spawn, whether it be feeding frenzy. I mean, there's lots of different settings on there, and to be honest, I mean, I run it all the time offshore fishing. I don't honestly know that it helps me get more bites because they hear this speaker and they're come swimming to it. The thing that I really think it does, though, is we run so many electronics now. I mean, if your trolling motor's up out of the water and your graph's still on, you can sit there and you can hear it pinging. You'll hear the ticks in it. So when you've got a Panoptics unit pinging, you've got a 2D on the front pinging, you've got 2D on the back pinging, and you got your clear view side view pinging as well. That's a lot of noise in the water. And one of my buddies told me something a long time ago I never really thought about because we never fished really clear water on the East Coast. I went out to California, and my good friend Cody Meyer, when I was doing my television show, we fished on Bullard's Bar, and we were talking about fishing deep, and he made a comment that stuck with me for a long time. And he said, we're sitting in 25 feet of water, and that's deep water to most people. But you think about the length of your bass boat from the trolling motor to the engine, and it's 22, 23 feet. So it's really not that far. So especially in clear water situations or cleaner water situations, you get all these electronics pinging, and it emits a sound. If we can hear it outside the water, you know good and well they can hear it in the water. So the thing the hydrowave kind of does for me is it's more of a confidence thing for me that it just covers up the other sounds that I'm making more so than it is attracting a fish to come to my boat to eat. It's more about camouflaging all the pinging noises and electronic noises that we run now on bass boats because we got so much equipment running. So I think it works as a very good camouflage.
You know, it might be hard to believe, but out here in California, we do a little bit of coyote hunting, and we use calls for coyotes to call them in. I'm wondering if it has that kind of an effect on the fish.
You know, the one thing that I have seen, especially fishing shad spawn, you can come up to a shad spawn and you know they're spawning there, and you can turn that thing on and you can put it into the water, and immediately you will see those shad come to the surface. Like it 100% does something. I don't know the science behind it, and I don't know why it works or how it works, but even in shallow water situations where you've had it turned on a lot of times, I've seen big gar and certain things just come right up to that speaker, looking at that speaker. So there's something to it. I don't know the science. I'm not a engineer by any stretch of the imagination, but there is something there that works, and I'm sure there is some calling ability to it. Like I said, for me, it's more of a confidence thing just to cover up the rest of the noise that I'm making out there.
Outstanding. That's in a lot of electronic equipment on the boat, and I am also not an engineer, but I worry about feedback, and I worry about static in my units, and I worry about getting them tuned in. Is what's the secret to that?
Well, one of the things is interference. And, my good buddy Nathan Martin over here in North Alabama came up with C Clear Power, which is a wiring harness that, hence the name, C Clear Power. Right. So it is a clean, clear power arrangement where this harness is designed specifically for your electronics. So it is wired directly to the battery, or you can do it through a cutoff switch like mine is, so I can cut the power to my units when I'm not using them. But this is an 8-gauge wire. It has takeouts at the console, takeouts up front with easy, fast connect wiring harness, wiring clips that even I can install, but it's clean power. So it takes away from aerators running, engine noise.
Yeah.
It takes away from everything else. It is clean, legitimate power from the battery directly to the units. One of the things that guys miss about electronics, and especially as technologically advanced as all this stuff has gotten now, trolling motors included, they're so sensitive that they'll pick up a lot of things in the water that you don't want them to pick up. Right. But in order for them to do the things that they need to do, they need power. And the way Nathan designed this harness was he basically took the logistics that Garmin put out for our Panoptics Livescope unit and designed the capability for that harness to run that unit. So what you got is, and I'm outside and I've got a spider tackling me here, but changing away from the spider. It doesn't matter if you go spend $10,000 on electronics. You can have the greatest, latest, best thing on the market in electronics. If you're not providing them the voltage that they need in order to perform the way they're performing, it don't matter what kind of units you got. They're not going to show you what they can show you. So the C Clear Power Harness provides a couple of things. It provides that energy that it needs. You got to have that amperage. I mean, I've got, I run lithium pro batteries. So at any given time on the front of my boat, I'll have 13.3, 13.4 volts to the front. So, and that's the issue is, if you don't have a heavy enough gauge wire, it doesn't matter how great your batteries are. The further you extend wiring to get power somewhere, you lose amperage as that goes forward. So the C Clear Power Harness fixes that, but it also cleans it up. So it takes all of your everything else that's running on the boat, whether it's live wells, bilge pumps, whatever, it is a clean source of power. So you're not drawing, you're not running through a main hub under the console that's running power off of those other things that we have to have in a boat as well. So it's C clear power. I'm not so sure that it shouldn't have been C clean power, because it does both.
Okay, well that's really good. I mean, that's one of the things that, I mean, interference is something that I've dealt with my graphs and stuff like that on my boat, and you work so hard to try to get it dialed in, and that sounds like the ticket right there. I wanted to ask you, in some of these northern swing events, in the Bass Tour and some of the other ones where they fish a lot of smallmouth lakes up north, I noticed in watching the live coverage that a lot of these anglers, they're watching the live scope and they're not casting at all. I come from a bass tournament where you try to get as many casts in during the course of the day as you can, but these guys are just looking for fish out there. Is that the way you approach this, or are you covering water more with casts? How are you doing it?
100% up north. I mean, we just finished the year with a super tournament at Sandusky Bay on Lake Erie. And, you can spend all the time you want to in practice and idle, and you can find rock piles and whatever, rock rows that have the fish on them. A prime example, I ran from Sandusky Bay to St. Clair on day 3. And in practice over there, I found a giant school of fish out on this one little high spot, and it's all sandgrass. And, I could catch them every drop for 4 or 5 drops, and I just left them alone. So I run back over there on day 3. Hadn't been there the first 2 days of the event. I get over there day 3. I stop where I'm supposed to stop, and I stop, I start pitching a drop shot around. I'm looking at my live scope, and I don't see the fish. I'm not getting bit. So I immediately just turn the trolling motor up a couple notches and just start widening my circle. And then I see a fish out in front of me on live scope, and I pitch a drop shot over to it, and I catch it, and it's like a 4.9. Wow. And immediately, as soon as you catch one, it's no different than any other lake. I mean, once one of them starts, it seems to ignite a feeding frenzy, and you can see on the live scope there's a lot more fish there. So I immediately reach down to the Garmin force, and I hit my anchor lock, and I make the same pitch for 20 minutes, and 20 minutes later I've got 19 pounds 11 ounces. So wow. Yeah, it is definitely a big deal, especially on the smallmouth, because the smallmouth don't usually hug as tight to the bottom, and you can see them a lot easier on live scope. But it's changed the way we approach a big body of water like that, especially because it makes you much more efficient. Instead of you fishing around for hours and hours and hours trying to get a bite, you troll around for about a third of that time or less, or idle around, and you can see what you want to fish when you come back. So it's really changed the narrative on anything deeper than 8 or 9 feet of water, 6 or 8 feet of water even. If those fish are out there where you can see them, it's completely changed the narrative of how we approach a bass tournament anymore. You broke a FLW record for just some massive sacks at Kentucky Lake, and I was kind of wondering on your approach there on those big limits that you had there. I mean, do you have to finesse those kind of fish, or can you power fish those kind of fish in deep water? If you finesse those kind of fish, you're done before you start. I mean, once you see a group of fish, I mean, I may be telling more than I want to tell here, but I always tell guys,
I'm good at that.
never, ever start those fish with anything smaller than the biggest thing you got on your deck, whether it's a giant swim bait or a big nasty crankbait. The big, you take every big bass in that school of fish, or any school of fish. I got another spider here, but any bass in any school of fish that's a giant, he didn't get giant by eating little bitty stuff. He got big because she's aggressive and she eats big gizzard shad, big brim, big whatever. They, those 5, 6, 7 pound class fish, naturally they grew up like all the rest of them, eating thread fins and eating whatever came around. But once they get to a certain size, those fish key in on those big giant gizzard shad, big giant brim. it's much more effective for them to eat once a day or twice a day than it is to chase a little school of threadfin around. So, I always start every school of fish that I stop on with the biggest, nastiest thing I've got laying on the deck, whether it's an 8-inch, cast stack heavy metal spoon or a 7-inch jerky J or, a big giant hardcore 7+ crankbait, something like that. I mean, it's always about the biggest, nastiest thing I got on the deck, because most of the time, the biggest, most aggressive fish in that school will eat first. It's a pecking order, just like you see a group of dogs running through your neighborhood, and there's one that's the alpha. There's an alpha in that school of fish too.
I want you to talk about that big spoon you were talking about. That's something that I'm fascinated with. I know that's kind of it's kind of an undercover thing that a lot of guys are throwing, but it's legit. Talk about what kind of a setup do you use to throw that big spoon?
That big spoon is it'll work on you. I mean, it's a big load. It's a big bait. It's 2 ounces. And the West Coast guys, don't forget about that, especially any of you fisheries that have kokanee in them. We came out to Bullard's Bar and shot a show about 4 years ago now. And the first cast I made with that thing on Bullard's Bar, I caught a 6-pound spotted bass. And so it looks just like a big giant kokanee, and they'll eat it out there too. But, that thing's got to be thrown on a super heavy rod. I throw it on a 7.2 extra heavy flipping stick, basically, and a real high speed, at least a 7-to-1 reel, but heavy line, 20-pound fluorocarbon, because that thing's dancing, bouncing, hitting itself on the way down, and it's very erratic. So, you never know when you're going to get it wrapped up in a hook or, your line wrapped up in a hook. So you need real heavy line, 20-pound fluorocarbon, heavy action rod. I throw it on a 7.8 extra heavy ducket fishing rod and a 7.1 to reel, 7.1-to-1 reel, something that's got some speed to it. Because once you get them, I mean, there's no fighting the fish on that thing. You turn the drag tight and you reel and you bring it to the boat. Because the downside to that big spoon is all the weight's outside of the mouth. So naturally you're going to lose a good percentage of them. But the faster you can lay it in the boat, the better off you are.
So you pull up on a ledge, you see that there's fish down there, you throw the big stuff first. If that's not working, you scale it down?
Actually, I don't. I mean, if they don't bite the big stuff, I'm going to the next school. I mean, you're going to run into a wad eventually. I mean, if you hit enough places fast enough, in a day's time, chances are you're going to roll in on a school that's ready and willing. And, that school that you stopped on and spent 10, 15 minutes hitting, in different angles and different baits and whatever, they may not have fired right then, but they may fire 2 hours later. So it's more about, if you pull up on them, almost every school that's ready to do business will bite on the very first cast, and you'll catch what you're going to catch out of it in the first 10 minutes.
And you can kind of tell by what you see on your screen whether they're ready or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's more about, I guess a pattern you see them in. They're closer together, they're tighter to the bottom. There's just certain ways that they look on the screen that just makes you think that they're going to bite. Now, all of them don't always bite. And there has been times you stop on ones and you think, man, these ain't going to bite, but I'm going to stop anyway, and they will bite. So it's not a perfect science, but, I'd say 7 out of 10 times if I see them on my units and they look like they're going to bite, they'll bite.
That's very cool. Hey, what would you say to somebody in the audience that's watching this, like me, who's totally intimidated by their electronics? What would you say? I mean, you're talking about someone who, I mean, I can do it, but I mean, the person that is wanting to get into this and it's tough to fish a target that they can't see with their eyes. What would you say to them?
It's time. I mean, it takes time just like anything else. I mean, you like I said, I know you've probably got a certain spinnerbait or a certain topwater or something that you've had a lot of experience with that you really put a lot of faith in. So the one thing I tell people, I've done a lot of electronics training the last 10 years. So one thing I tell people is, you've got a place somewhere, whether it be, on the West Coast, East Coast, it doesn't matter where you're at, but you've got a place where you've caught fish offshore, and you may or may not know why they're there. but it's more about looking, and then when you see something that you think's a fish, you got to turn around and make a cast. It's the one thing that I'll tell anybody and everybody: you absolutely have to run track lines. You have to run your trails. Those trails don't lie. I mean, wherever you just idled across and you saw a brush pile with some fish on it or whatever that you saw fish out there, your units lay down a trail or a track line where just came through. So you know that those fish are in that track line. So there's a couple of things that come before that though, is go out to your lake or your marina, wherever you take off. I'm sure you got a buoy out there somewhere. So idle by that buoy, and then you can get an understanding of distances of how far you can cast versus, a visible target. Say you got a channel marker buoy and you idle by that, you lay a track line down, you go past it, what you think's about a cast, and you drop your trolling motor, you turn back around and you line up on that buoy and you make a cast to that buoy, and you can start seeing, your distances versus, what you see on the graph versus how far that buoy is away from you. So that just gives you a visual. And even another thing you can do is as you're idling past that buoy, just hit a waypoint button on your graph, and it drops a waypoint on your screen. And then you can tell, when you stand up versus the visual that you've got of a buoy versus where the waypoint is on your graph of how to line up, of how to get your cast back to that spot where you saw those fish or what have you. So it's more about confidence and time, and and some of that stuff. It's kind of like a baseball player or basketball player doing drills. I mean, you go out and you find you something visible, you drop a waypoint on it, and you circle it, and by looking at the graph then how far your cast is going versus where the waypoint is, but you've got something visual there that shows you exactly where you drop that waypoint.
Well, Jason, that is absolute golden stuff. And this is one of those kind of episodes where people are going to want to come back and watch this over and over again because there's so much good information in this. Thanks for being with us today. That was absolutely golden.
Man, I appreciate y'all having me anytime, and check out the Garmin units. You want to see what you're missing, you'll see it. And it's good stuff, and I've thoroughly enjoyed running it. We've spent a lot of time, myself and Cody Meyer and a lot of our guys that came over with Garmin when we really made a push back into the freshwater market. But offshore fishing is it's way simpler and easier than flipping down a grass line for 8 miles trying to find a wad of fish once you figure out and trust and understand what you're looking at on your units.
Fish have got to be less pressured too, right?
For the most part, they are. I mean, obviously on the Tennessee River, especially in 2020, I mean, this is the old COVID year where nobody seemed to go to school or nobody worked. So there was people fishing. You go to a boat ramp on Wednesday, if you didn't get there by 8 o'clock, you couldn't get a parking place. So it's been a little different this year, but for the most part, yeah, those fish are much less pressured. And even though they're still getting pressured, I mean, a lot of those wads of fish out there will, if they get to sit there for an hour, 2 hours and rest, without somebody beating on them, they're much easier to catch than, flipping down a bank chasing chasing those brim fish, we call them out here. So we try to focus on those shad fish that sit out there in certain locations, wait on their food to come to them.
Well, Jason, thanks a lot. Best of luck to you, and we'll keep track of your progress. And thanks for being with us today.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me.
All right.